Guys, welcome back to Total Tactics FPL. It's Fran here and back with my Game Week 10 team review as well as my Game Week 11 transfer plans. As far as my transfer plans, of course, they're informed primarily by the team review because there are some developments in Game Week 10 that I think are quite crucial to how I plan out for the future. On top of that, too, I think, of course, a little bit of regrets within my Game Week 10 team review considering my transfers last week, but of course, positives as well. If we just look at my team, I'm actually currently ranked 60,000 in the world, it says on FPL, but that's not true. I'm actually ranked 70,000. That's the actual post rank based on a lot of people getting Andreas points off the bench, and fortunately Neco Williams as well playing, so shout out to him for playing 32 minutes. For Game Week 10, of course, Solanke was a huge success in terms of the transfer that I made into him. However, Trossard from Saka was, of course, a huge upsetting performance in terms of the expectation gap. I think Saka was someone that I didn't expect to necessarily do so well versus Liverpool. But another key sign was him getting the penalty when Jesus actually drew the penalty. In previous times, we've seen Martinelli take penalties for ones that he's earned. Maybe that's still the case. But we didn't really have, I think, historical precedent for Saka actually take a penalty that someone else earned. And it was quite interesting to see Saka take the penalty. That's something that definitely hurt as someone who owned Saka just as early as last week. As far as Saka, though, of course, a very deserving haul, I think, because it's one of those games where, because Liverpool are quite a front-facing attack as well, and they are trying to play quite progressively, someone like Saka can run in behind. But I don't think in most games where teams actually set up with a low block that Saka has actually been particularly effective. So Saka does seem to make sense. And in a sense, he's one of those players that you like to have versus Leeds. But for the easier fixtures going forwards, I still think Martinelli and Jesus are the better options. The thing about Saka, though, is that getting penalties, which I think this Arsenal team will inevitably draw, does make him an interesting transfer target for the future. And that's going to be definitely one to think about. As far as James, he was a bit disappointing, but I think he's still one to keep. Ultimately, there's going to be probably 75% of fixtures that he plays where he will look like an excellent asset. And I think Potter has transformed the Chelsea team in the right direction. Another thing with Chelsea too is it seems like Mason Mount might be the most nailed on player for the time being, especially since Sterling and Aubameyang are players that are most subject to rest because they are trying to also fight on a European front. And James as well was someone who kind of suffered a similar fate with Cucurella actually playing instead when some people thought that Chilwell might have, assumed the position as the starting left back. As far as Kane, it seems like he has an injury knock, but I don't think it's a huge issue. And then Solanke, as I said, was a huge positive. And I think I'm very happy with going for him because when you look at Fulham, the reason why I brought him on specifically was because I know a lot of people don't rate Solanke and his actual abilities as a player, but regardless, he was still subject to play some of the worst teams in the league, and this Fulham matchup is exactly it. Fulham is actually the worst team in the league when it comes to expected goals conceded, so a perfect opportunity for Solanke to score versus the team that he actually scored twice versus in the Championship last season, if you kind of like those statistics. Realistically, I just think the Fulham defense is still very, very poor, and it's a good fixture for him to own. And the thing about Solanke too is, as I mentioned in my team selection video, he is meant to be a pick that you don't keep for the long term. So in the future, I would expect Solanke to be someone that I call upon in specifically good games. So for example, in the West Ham and the Tottenham games, I might not actually play him as a starter, whereas in the Leeds game, I probably might want to bring him off of my bench. That is kind of the opportunity you have with Solanke being so cheap. There are other options in FPL that kind of assume that role now. I guess Edouard is one of those who are quite interesting at a 5.3 price point. He does kind of cover Crystal Palace. I'm not exactly sure if you'd like to move into him, but he's also a very, very cheap kind of budget forward that could potentially just sit on your bench on most game weeks. Martinelli is someone I'm very, very happy to keep. Very happy with his performance as well. We did expect that Martinelli could exploit Trent and his positioning as well as a defender. So positive signs there, and I think Martinelli still has the underlying stats going forward. Saka, of course, a little bit more of the goal threat now, especially with the penalties. But still, Martinelli is still absurdly priced, and we talked about that all the way through. Still, no Foden in this team. I think it might have to be a delayed transfer, and we'll talk about that in transfer plans, because I'm going to do a kind of game week 11 to 14 sort of planning session, just to kind of cover my thoughts on players and the trajectory of where I think a lot of our FPL teams will go. And I think the main topic, of course, brought up has been the subject of the 1 million, because unless you choose to go for Salah in Game Week 12 and look to captain him, I do think a lot of people actually instead think about saving another transfer for Game Week 13 and then optimizing around there, especially if they're a Kane owner, because look, Kane obviously has a good fixture on paper, I guess, versus Newcastle at home. I don't think that's necessarily a great matchup. You're, of course, missing potentially the Bournemouth game, but that is followed by the Liverpool game, when you could actually just move into someone like a Jesus who could operate just as well for Kane during that kind of fixture run. So that's an opportunity there, and that also means you can therefore bolster another midfield piece. now that the midfielders are so interesting at that 8.0 price point. So moving into Foden, the capacity to do that is going to be quite interesting, I would say, from an FPL point of view. But that's going to be it for the Game Week 10 team review. Let's actually move into the transfer plans. So let's head into talking about my Game Week 11 transfer plans. And potentially this is not just necessarily what I'm going to do for Game Week 11, but actually Game Weeks 11 to 14, the coverage of at least 4 game weeks to think about what kind of transfers I could make and so on and so forth. As far as the actual team for Game Week 11, because I think the Game Week 10 team was quite strong and I don't really have any key issues with it. Trossard actually has a much better game. He did blank versus Tottenham, but now this Brentford team looks so open. I'm pretty happy to actually own him as an asset. Yes, of course, it could be sad to not own Saka versus Leeds, where they could easily draw another penalty. But I'm going to have to just move away from Saka for now and just accept the L there. Trossard, of course, is still an interesting pick. He has Brentford and Nottingham Forest in Game Week 13. So, Game Week 12, sorry, and that's going to be a fantastic avenue to own Trossard. But he still might be a transfer away in Game Weeks 13 and beyond. As far as the actual team, though, Trippier, Cancelo, James, Pope. The only issue, of course, is the double Newcastle defense versus United. Yes, of course, there might be an opportunity to move away from a double Newcastle defense, but I really can't see myself going out of Trippier. Trippier's been such an interesting asset in open play, and we talk about that all the time, whereas Pope seems to be the one asset that I might move away from. Do I actually need to move away from Pope? I don't think so, because Pope has a great fixture in Game Week 12 versus Everton. I'll probably just concede that I'll take an L here with Pope when it comes to his fixture versus United. I do think United will score at Old Trafford. They have been quite a solid team at home as of late, and I still think even with the Martial injury, they still look quite good. Anthony is, of course, a huge upgrade on someone like a Sancho who hasn't really been in form. As far as Cancelo, you still want to play him versus Liverpool, even though Liverpool do have the opportunity to I would say, break any team's clean sheet. When it comes to it, of course, Cancelo has simply the opportunity to do the unimaginable, really, when it comes to the goal scoring point of view, and even creating some fantastic assists as well. So no real complaints there. And then with James, I still think that this Aston Villa team have been very, very poor when it comes to expected goal involvements. You'd hope that James is able to actually play here, especially since he got rest. I don't think that Potter is necessarily going to rest James every other game. I think that the fact that he was given rest versus Wolves was a key opportunity to rest him in a tight schedule, and hopefully he'll be able to start a couple of games, including the Aston Villa one, depending on the Milan result. Trossard, of course, happy to own him as discussed. Zaha, Martinelli, Maddison, no real issues because they have a great run of fixtures. Maddison actually is the one closest to having a bad fixture, with the exception to Martinelli's blank. Maddison does play Man City in the near future. Solanke, Haaland, Kane all have effectively good matchups because this Liverpool defense isn't something that we really, I would say, expect highly from, especially when the City team could pretty much penetrate any team in the world, I would say. Kane, of course, is a captaincy option here, but I don't think there's much to really talk about in Game Week 11. When you look at my bench, though, that's where the glaring problems are. Andreas, of course, looks like an exceptionally interesting option. I might even try to find a way to play him. But that really just means I'm going to bench another player who effectively has a good game, such as a Solanke. I do think Solanke actually has a higher ceiling than Andreas, even though Andreas did look quite good in the West Ham game. And that's really what it comes down to. Schär and Neco Williams, these are the problem points, right? Because I don't really want to be fielding a triple Newcastle defense too often. And Neco Williams is another problem. It's just simply because he's now playing 32 minutes, 45 minutes a game, and he's entered that territory where he has to compete with Serge Aurier. I do think there is an opportunity here to actually consider Neco Williams as the transfer for Game Week 12. Game Week 11, can't really see it because I can't justify, I would say, dropping Trippier, and I don't see myself making a goalkeeper transfer for now because I still have so much money in the bank. I don't really need to downgrade away from Pope. I'd like to actually find a way to spend my money as soon as 12/13. So looking at the team, Neco Williams is the transfer away. So what do I do with Neco Williams? I think on the subject of Neco Williams replacements, I think it's really simply between 3 clubs. Of course, I've selected some of the cheapest players from these 3 teams in Webster, Mings, and Guehi. These are probably the most nailed options that you can consider. Of course, you have Estupinian from Brighton as well, but you are gambling on the minutes. He could even be an early sub in some games because we've already seen him subbed on twice quite early into the game, I'd say around 70, 80 minutes for now, but we could also see, of course, an early sub, which is something that I would say is quite critical to a defender, specifically when you're looking for a coverage of a Game Week 12 gap. When you look at Game Weeks 11 and 12 in totality, I do think, of course, Webster and Guehi went out compared to Mings. Mings is a terrible fixture versus Chelsea. And also, even the Fulham fixture, when we talk about that, I really think that's a very tough game for Aston Villa to keep a clean sheet, because even though Aston Villa have been a very good defensive team and Fulham have been quite a poor team, as of late, specifically on form, I would say Fulham are one of those teams that you'd expect to score every game, and they probably would actually just get outscored, right? We saw that in the West Ham game, we saw that in the Newcastle game as well. They're just not a very good defensive team, but they actually are very, very attacking, and they do have that kind of edge to them. As far as Webster and Guehi, I think when you look at the two teams, of course, Crystal Palace have had very tough fixtures, but Brighton equally so. They've already come across some of the toughest fixtures in their schedule, and they've still come out very, very strong when it comes to the team expected goals conceded. This is a statistic that shows how effective you are as a team in terms of underlying stats and actually preventing XG from the opposing teams. And Brighton, of course, this is mostly the work of Potter. So you could argue that the managerial change has a little bit of a change in the element of this. But if you look at the Brighton Tottenham game, which is I think, good opportunity to have a look at what Brighton are up against, right, when they're facing another top team outside of, at home. I think that's a good example of how good this Brighton team could be. And of course, I think there's such a huge gap between this Tottenham team and Nottingham Forest as well. When you look at the Liverpool fixture and Brighton conceding 3 versus Liverpool, I really just think that you have to say that Liverpool are one of the top attacking teams, definitely one of the poorer defensive this season, specifically when it comes to the eye test. But we know this Liverpool team can score even versus some of the best teams. In Arsenal, Liverpool scoring 2 goals there, potentially even able to actually miss out on a penalty early in the game when Gabriel actually had a handball opportunity. That's basically showing you that this Liverpool team really shouldn't be looked at as an eye test for whether Brighton are a good defense. I think Brighton should and remain to be a good defense. On paper, they actually probably are the defense that I actually rate the most, especially since Crystal Palace haven't shown us much defensively this season. So I think Webster for me is the easiest pick here. When we look at Game Week 12, as discussed, I would already probably move into Webster at this point in time. This would be a great opportunity to seize on Brighton defense. As far as the other transfer, I might actually force a transfer towards, away from Kane, into someone like a Liverpool attacker, and that's going to be either Jota, Nunez, or Firmino. The reason why I would probably do this is because I still think Liverpool actually have a fantastic triple game run where they actually are playing West Ham, Nottingham Forest, and Leeds in a kind of 3-game week window where you could actually operate with a Liverpool forward. And of course, that's a little bit more expensive than a Foden or a Jesus and a Saka that we would all like to move into in Game Week 13. But I do think that jumping the gun here in Game Week 12 is a good opportunity to do so because Kane actually has a very poor matchup versus United. I do think Kane, of course, can score. We've seen already the consistency that Kane has had this season. He's practically been nailed for 6 to 7 points a week. And maybe that would be a huge kind of waste of a transfer, especially when I can save 2 free transfers to move simply into City and Arsenal assets in the next week. However, Jota, I do think, alongside Firmino, Nunez, do present themselves as options to think about. The difference, of course, is Firmino has played the most minutes this season, so his underlying stats have probably averaged out to exactly what they should be or close to what they should be. Darwin and Jota have played much less minutes. Jota, of course, was injured for the early part of the season. Darwin, of course, forced that really silly red card from himself. Darwin, I think, is the kind of game changer here in FPL because we did talk about him in the Community Shield match. And I think when we just talk about Liverpool this season, I don't think their attack has necessarily dropped off too much. We still see them being capable of actually creating a lot of high goal scoring games. We still see their creativity quite high, quite close to an Arsenal, a little bit away from City, of course, that I think are untouchable at this point in time. So therefore, there is an argument to say, why waste the transfer into a Liverpool asset when you can move into Foden as soon as Game Week 13, save the transfers for that. And I think that's actually a very good argument. But when we talk about the Liverpool strikers, they still have been very effective, and that 3-game week window is exactly what we're talking about. So I would say Darwin is probably the most interesting option because just from the eye test so far, especially going back to the Community Shield game and any kind of involvements he's had, yes, of course, he's had bad days. I think definitely this season when we've seen that. But in recent games, I think he has been, once again, the most lethal asset. Someone who occupies those central positions and controls them well. What's interesting about Jota, though, is he does have the flexibility to actually play both the central positions and also the wide positions. So if Liverpool maintain this 4-4-2 structure, you could see, for example, Darwin get subbed off, and then someone like Carvalho can come in, and Jota could move into a centre forward position. Whereas there isn't that kind of counterpart for Darwin's ability or Firmino's ability necessarily to play on the wing if, let's say, Klopp doesn't feel like they're having a good game. So I think that's an opportunity there to think about. So Jota, of course, might actually have the best amount of minutes projections because of Luis Diaz's injury. On top of that, you have, I think, Firmino and Nunez, they do occupy different roles in the team. Firmino actually has, I would say, outscored his projections quite hard because the underlying stats have still been quite good for Firmino. He actually has 0.55 expected goals, which is actually very good. And this season, I think he's actually stepped up very well. He's actually scored in almost all the key games, with the exception to some of the tougher games. But Liverpool, you're just really banking on here some of the easier games, and we saw Firmino be devastating as a player in that 9-0 victory versus Bournemouth. So these options are all interesting. I'd probably back Darwin Nunez for now, but I think Jota's probably a close second. And even Firmino, I would say no real issues with going into him as an asset. And it's kind of hard. You kind of probably have to just throw a dart on the wall, really, and then just pick one of the 3 if you'd like to move into a Liverpool striker. The alternative, of course, is that you probably tank this game week 12, make it a poor week, and then actually move into City and Arsenal assets directly in Game Week 13. Anyways, if we actually continue with my Game Week 12 to 14, I do actually plan for now at least going for Jota and then maybe a Trossard captaincy. I'd probably flip between one of the two. I could obviously go for Darwin, of course, who is probably my preferred name. And then in Game Week 13, I would just put Trossard and Webster on the bench and then play Andreas because he has a good fixture versus Leeds. Here is an opportunity, of course, where it does seem like Foden is actually missing from this team. There's 2.9 in the bank. I can't necessarily go from Trossard into Foden here because it would take a hit. I much prefer going for Jesus for Southampton than Foden versus Brighton. Yes, of course, City play at home at the Etihad, but I do think Jesus just simply has a better individual matchup here versus Southampton. Saka, of course, is another option, but I do think if I had to choose between the three of them, I'd probably still pick Jesus for now. And then on Game Week 14, I would actually just simply move into Foden when he has that Leicester game, which is a much easier game and a very easy fixture to move into Foden. And that's going to be my transfer plan for the near future. This would be a 3-4-3 formation, just simply because I still see the value in some of the forwards. We're still seeing a lot of good projections from a lot of players. Your coverage of City, I think, only really needs to be Foden, Cancelo, and Haaland. And then, of course, options like Maddison might move into players like Saka in the near future, especially since, as you can see here, Maddison has a tough fixture versus Man City. So that could be another opportunity as well to move away from Maddison potentially. I could exercise that transfer first as opposed to moving out of Trossard, but those are the options for now. But that's going to be it for my Game Week 11 transfer plans. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. And of course, we'll kind of deep dive into this on the live stream at the deadline this weekend. And we'll also just talk about my transfer plans going forward in my Game Week 11 team selection video. But I think this is pretty close to exactly what I'd like to do. The only exception being maybe whether or not I'd like to go into a Liverpool forward on Game Week 12. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys very, very shortly.